Nature's Phoenix, second edition, is now available to purchase. It's packed with valuable insights on fire ecology, including the topics we'll be covering in this episode. If you're interested in learning more, you can find a link to purchase the book in the description below.
Welcome back to the webinar series, Chronicles from Nature's Phoenix, where co-authors Dr. Dominick DellaSala of Wild Heritage and Dr. Chad Hanson of the John Muir Project share the screen with other renowned wildfire experts.
In this episode, Dr. Chad Hanson and Bryant Baker delve into Chapter 11 of Nature's Phoenix, second edition, to critically examine the overgrown forests narrative. This commonly held belief blames severe wildfires in the western U.S. on overly dense forests caused by fire suppression. But is this narrative backed by science? Watch to witness Dr. Chad Hanson and Bryant Baker dissect the evidence, challenge misconceptions, and reveal what's really driving wildfire behavior in our forests.
Welcome, everyone, to the third in the Nature's Phoenix Wildfire webinar series. This whole webinar series is devoted to exploring different chapters from the newly released second edition of the book, Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. And I really encourage everyone out there to get this resource. This book is a tremendous resource. As described on the slide here, we're talking about 416 pages, hundreds of citations, 12 chapters covering topics such as pyrodiversity, logging myths, climate change, beetle outbreaks, and proper fire planning, and 18 leading contributors covering science and policy. It's a tremendous resource. So I really encourage you to purchase a copy, read it, and use it because it's a tremendous resource. In this webinar series, we've been focusing on particular chapters from the book and bringing in some of the co-authors of those chapters to delve into those points more deeply. Today, we're focusing on, I think, a crucial point drawn from, I believe it's chapter 11 of the book. Today's title is Confounding the Overgrown Forest Narrative. And the misunderstandings around the concept of overgrown forests and how it's been translating both into bad fire policy, bad forest policy, and bad climate policy, I think make it a crucial topic to explore in depth. And I'm really glad that we have our two speakers today, Bryant Baker and Chad Hanson, to delve into that. And I would say that beyond what they're going to present here, the chapter itself, I think, is a great resource, not just in terms of the information it provides, but one thing that I really appreciate is I think for some people, it can be a challenge to see the different claims being made by science papers out there regarding forest issues. And I think there's a tendency to say, well, this one says that and the other one says something else. How am I supposed to figure out what's right? And I think that the chapter in the book that they co-authored really does a nice job of walking you through how you can look at studies making misleading claims and understand how that's happening, what's being left out, what's being misrepresented, and how you can get more accurate information in response. So again, I really recommend the book as a whole, and that chapter is a great illustration of how to better understand fire science and get past this dilemma of, this side versus that side, how to really do the work of understanding the science. So with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Bryant Baker. And Bryant Baker is a GIS analyst based in Ventura County, California, who's been working in forest and public lands conservation for nearly a decade. He's co-authored several peer-reviewed papers on fire ecology and management in shrubland and forest ecosystems in California and the Western US. His maps on land use, wildfire, and other conservation issues have been published by the Los Angeles Times, the San Diego Tribune, Oregon Public Broadcasting, Montana Free Press, Mother Jones, and other media outlets. In addition to his conservation work and research, Bryant is a plant and landscaping photographer specializing in post-fire habitats and native plants in California. And his work has appeared in books, magazines, and newspapers across the region. So with that, let me turn it over to Bryant. Oh, and before I do so, just a quick reminder, we're going to save all questions until after both speakers have presented, but please feel free at any time to start posting your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. So with that, I'll give you Bryant.
Great. Thank you, Doug. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Let's see here. And you should be able to see, you're not seeing my PowerPoint presenter notes or anything like that. You're just seeing my actual slides. Great.
Correct.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about some different aspects of tree mortality that we touched upon in the chapter, and I think it's going to make sense by the end of the presentation why I'm talking about this. I'm going to sort of tie it all together, and then that will, I think, hopefully dovetail nicely into Dr. Hanson's presentation. So I want to start with, I'm going to really just be focusing on the Western United States. So this is kind of what we're seeing here. And it's maybe easy to sort of pick out the forest here. There's obviously a lot of desert and, sort of shrubland and sagebrush, those kind of areas. But we can actually sort of highlight the different forest types found across the Western United States. And we can break this up into a bunch of different forest types. And this is a little bit overwhelming, and I don't expect you to read through this extremely long list of different forest ecosystems. But we can sort of consolidate these. This is my attempt to consolidate these into some really broad forest types. And the reason I'm showing you this is to illustrate that there is no one way to describe forest in the Western United States. There are big differences between the Pacific temperate rainforest up in the Pacific Northwest and pinyon juniper forest or woodlands in the Great Basin, for example. And we can sort of further delineate these forests into different, or we can categorize them into different fire regimes. And so this is, again, an attempt to sort of broadly categorize them. This is not a perfect way to look at this. But the point is you'll notice a lot of forest types in the Western United States that are relatively infrequent fire regimes. So they experience really naturally long intervals between fires. And so when we talk about, the concept of overgrown forest, that generally comes from the last century or so that fire suppression has really been at the forefront of fire policy and forest management policy in at least in national forest in the Western United States. But my point here is that concept of overgrown forest really, it's debated more so in these more frequent forests, more frequent fire type forests. But you'll notice that these areas that are relatively infrequent, there's really not much debate there about this concept. So, if you have, Rocky Mountain lodgepole pine that goes centuries between natural fires, the idea that over the last 75 years or 100 years, we've suppressed fires enough to cause those forests to become overgrown is just simply not applicable. Now, that I just kind of wanted to get that out of the way. The real sort of meat of my presentation here is going to be about a paper that actually came out in 2022 that I think is a really important paper to understand. It has some issues that I'm going to sort of go through here, and this will make sense again by the end of this. And I just want to point out that this paper and other papers like it, they tend to get a lot of press coverage. So this one, this study that came out, it sort of had this big finding, which was that in the Southern Sierra Nevada forest there, over the last decade. So this was between 2011 and 2020, that about a third of those southern Sierra Nevada forests were basically killed or really transitioned to non-forest, was how the study put it. And so you see a lot of these types of headlines from the last couple of years that focus on this. And this paper gets a lot of citations currently, and it's used to sort of basically say, hey, forests are currently overgrown, and therefore they're experiencing really extreme fire behavior and big deviations from natural fire regimes. And I'm going to go into why there are some major problems with this paper and what that means for how we think about the way forests are currently structured, at least in the Southern Sierra, and how they are maybe changing as well. So this is the paper. It's a pretty big study. And again, that main finding, 30% of the Southern Sierra conifer forest extent transitioned to non-forest vegetation during 2011 to 2020. So this is kind of the big map that came out of, this is the main figure, I would say, that came out of that paper. And so you can see anywhere that's not gray or white, that was considered by the authors conifer forest in 2011. And if it is purple, any shade of purple, that means that it transitioned by 2020, it had transitioned to non-forest. All the green that you see, that means that the forest had stayed forest by their definition. Okay. So this is really important to kind of understand this, because you're going to see these colors a lot, because I'm reproducing a lot of these. We're going to zoom in on some places. And I think the first thing you have to understand is how they define forest. So a conifer forest, at least. First of all, they must be dominated by conifer species. That seems obvious. They must be about 5 meters in height, and they need to have at least 25% canopy cover. Anything else is considered non-forest. And I want to really highlight this canopy cover issue. This is, I think, the most crucial part of maybe the main shortcoming with this paper, which is that most other studies, this is unusual to consider anything with less than 25% canopy cover non-forest. Usually the cutoff is 10%. So once you get below 10%, you're now in, savanna territory, or just not, there's not really any trees, right? And so just so you're aware, canopy cover, if you imagine that we're looking down from above on top of let's say it's a square 30 meters by 30 meters. If we measured basically this is the easy way to think about it. Just think about if we measured the area of the canopies and then totaled all that up and divided it by the area of the square here, and then multiplied that by 100, there would be percent canopy cover. That's probably the easiest way to envision it. And I want to go back to this issue of using 25% canopy cover as a threshold for determining whether something is forest or non-forest. So if you look at this area, you might think, okay, yeah, that's a Jeffrey pine forest or a ponderosa pine forest, depending on where you are in the U.S. In this case, we're in the Los Padres National Forest in California, and so these are actually mostly Jeffrey pine. There's some ponderosa in there a little bit, but this is a Jeffrey pine forest. It's quite open. This is in the Chumash Wilderness, so it's a very open forest. It hasn't really had any management, historically or in the modern era. And if you were to guess, I can't really have the back and forth with the audience as I might in a live setting, but I would probably at this point ask you, for people to raise their hands and try to guess what the percent canopy cover is. And I measured this at about 17% canopy cover. So it's very open. Now, according to that paper by Steele et al., this would not qualify as forest. This is obviously, when you're on the ground, this is a mature Jeffrey pine forest. This is a mature conifer forest. But in that paper, it would not qualify as forest because of that 25% canopy cover threshold. Now, this is that same exact spot. So this is where I was standing. We're now looking at satellite imagery. So we're looking straight down, and this is the view of that photo. So this is kind of what we are looking at. So just keep that in mind, that this is what a forest that is between 10% and 25% canopy cover looks like. This is, again, a very open forest, but it is still clearly forest. Okay, so let's go back to this map, and we're going to actually, we're going to zoom in on an area up here where, so I didn't mention this before, but we're looking at the Southern Sierra. Obviously, I hope this is obvious. These are wildfire perimeters that the authors sort of highlighted. There were other wildfires during this period, but these are the ones for some reason that they were sort of centering on. And I want to go up here and look at this fire. This is the Donnell fire from 2018. And you'll notice that it looks like almost the entire fire transition, the area that burned in that fire transitioned to non-forest, because it is, again, all purple there. So we're going to zoom in. This is the figure that actually I created and put in the chapter. So this is one of my contributions to the chapter. I'm not going to try to break this figure down. I'm actually going to show you some other figures that maybe simplify this a little bit. But this is what we're looking at now. This is the Donnell fire, and we also merged another fire that had burned the year before called the McCormick fire. This was 2017. They're right next to each other, and I wanted to look at them both kind of at the same time. So that's what you're seeing here, is that merged perimeter. Now, what I did was I had all of the data from Steele et al., and I wanted to compare it to a different data set and look at what other data we're showing in terms of canopy cover, percent canopy cover. And so I went to Landfire. This is a big multi-agency data set that is very useful for a lot of different things. It has there are tons and tons of data sets in this big database, and it's not something that's uncommon to use. This is actually one of the authors of Steele et al. Is on this paper, and they used Landfire for some stuff. So it's not like I went and found some obscure data set to use here for comparison's sake. This is actually a pretty good data set to use for this purpose. Now, this is kind of like the figure that I showed you before, but I've simplified it a little bit here. So this is these are the data from the Steele et al. Method, right? So they provide their data, and we're able to sort of reconstruct this with the data that they provided. And you can see that purple, again, are areas that were forest in 2011, but by 2020 were being classified as non-forest. And presumably the reason that these areas, this purple area, is non-forest in 2020 is because of these two fires in 2017 and 2018. And you'll see little patches of green where the forest persisted, according to Steele et al. Now, when you total all this up, it was about 12,000, a little over 12,000 hectares were classified as transitioning to non-forest by 2020. Now, if we apply the other data set, the Landfire data set, and we use the exact same canopy cover threshold. So we're looking at tree-dominated canopy cover here. And what I did was I limited it to the same exact area. So if Steele et al. Had considered, there are these little white patches, those were considered non-forest in 2011. So we're just sort of ignoring those areas, right? And so what you see is quite a different picture. I'm just going to kind of go back and forth here, right? There is a much greater area that is not being classified as non-forest by 2022. This is the year that I used, because by 2020, the 2020 Landfire data set for canopy cover didn't quite capture all of the fire activity from 2020. So I was using 2022, which is nice because it also gives some time for if there's any delayed mortality after the fire. So we're actually being a little bit conservative here using this data set. Okay, so now you'll notice that this method delineated about 6,600 hectares that had transitioned from forest to non-forest. And I'll talk a little bit about why even saying it's transitioning from forest to non-forest maybe isn't the right way to think about it either. I'm just using the sort of verbiage of Steele et al. Okay, but the impression here is that there is something going on with the Steele et al. Method that is causing it to overestimate this transition from forest to non-forest, or in other words, it's causing it to not properly classify areas that are forested in 2020 as forest. And we can actually zoom in. This is not something we just have to look at like pretty colors here. We can actually go and look at some satellite imagery from after the fire and see what this looks like. So now we've zoomed in on an area, and what I've done here is anywhere that you see satellite imagery, that was purple on the previous map, but I've just made the purple transparent. I hope that makes sense. But what you're seeing now is all this satellite imagery that you can actually see, that is considered in Steele et al. As non-forest. And this is a couple of years, this is actually several years after the fire. So some delayed mortality has happened. You can clearly see that this area burned at high severity. And so it obviously doesn't have 25% canopy cover. Whether you should call that transitioning to non-forest is a different issue that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But what I want you to look at is this. Very obviously, there is still conifer forest here, mature conifer forest, right? We can see the conifer trees. Maybe they're a little bit more open because this area burned at low to moderate severity. And so this is some sort of natural thinning that is taking place in this area. But I would not classify this whole area as non-forest, right? But that's exactly what Steele et al. Did in their 2022 paper. Now, if we do the exact same thing with land fire is correctly identifying all of that as still forested by 2022, and that makes sense. So again, there's something going on here, and we can look at other areas too. I could do this all day, and I'm not going to do this all day, but I just want to show one other area. Let me get this nice. There's heterogeneous patterns here, right? So there's some areas that burned at higher severity. There's areas that burned at more moderate severity, and there's some low severity patches here. But again, Steele et al. In their paper are classifying all of this that you see that's not green or white. They're classifying that as non-forest by this point. But again, land fire is correctly identifying that as still forested, even when we use that 25% canopy cover threshold. So there's something not quite right. This isn't just about whether or not you should use a canopy cover threshold of 25%. There is something, I think, fundamentally wrong with the Steele et al. Method, and I still haven't quite figured out what that is. But we can look at some other areas too. I want to look at the rough fire. This is from 2015, so we're going to go sort of to the middle section of this Southern Sierra region. And this area, again, anything that you see that is color, that was considered forest in 2011. And by 2020, by Steele et al., their method, if it's purple, it's considered non-forest. If it's green, it's still considered forest, right? And so they classified almost 20,000 hectares as non-forest, transitioned to non-forest by 2020. And if we can zoom in on an area, I thought I had, yeah, here, I want to show you this actually. Sorry, I got my slides mixed up. So this is the land fire method, however. And so you can see there's a lot more forest that is basically is staying forest by this 25% threshold, canopy cover threshold. So I want to go here. This is really interesting. So we're back at the Steele et al. Method, and this is a sequoia grove. These are giant sequoias. You can actually see their massive boles. You can see them here. They're very distinct in the satellite imagery. And the Steele et al. Method is basically saying this whole, almost this entire grove of giant sequoia transitioned to non-forest, despite the fact that most of these sequoias, and it seems like most of the non-sequoia trees around them, survived the fire, right? This mostly burned at low to moderate severity fire. This wasn't like a high severity fire that came through here and killed most of the trees. Now, if we go to the land fire method, it again correctly is identifying most of this grove as being still forested by 2022. And I want to look at I'm going to look at two more areas as part of this study. This one is from an area that didn't burn in a wildfire. So one of the other things that their paper that they found was that outside of burn areas, there were things like drought and bark beetles that were also causing forests to transition to non-forest. So let's zoom in. This is an area that they actually highlight as being particularly heavy mortality from drought and bark beetles. And so they're showing a lot of that transitioning from forest to non-forest. And so if we zoom in on this area, again, we see this problem where for some reason their method is just missing a ton of what should be classified as forested. They're very obviously this has more than 25% canopy cover, but it's not being picked up by their method. Land fire, though, it is picking it up. And I'm not saying that land fire, this method is perfect either. It has its own classification problems, as do pretty much as every method does. All these data sets are imperfect. But my point, I think, here is that I don't know why the authors maybe didn't do a little bit more ground truthing or data validation by looking at other data sets or just looking at some satellite imagery. I think they would have found that something was off about their method. And this is the last area I'll show you from this paper. I found this really interesting because some of the same authors, as part of Steele et al., they were on this paper. And I think this is a really interesting paper. And I think it's got some really, really fascinating findings. But if we look at the Illilouette Basin, which is sort of a highlight of this paper, and it's been an area where there's been a lot of research done over the last few decades because basically the National Park Service, this is in Yosemite, have the Park Service has allowed natural wildfires to burn in this basin. And so this basin is considered to have a somewhat restored fire regime, according to these authors. And so let's look at it in terms of the Steele et al. Method here. So we're going to just zoom in on this area. Again, Steele et al. Is showing that all this area that's not green or white, it is showing up as non-forest in 2020. And this is an image that is after 2020. So I don't know exactly what's going on. I can tell you that land fire, again, though, is correctly classifying this as forest. So something is odd. And I would think that, with the attention on this basin in terms of forest and fire management, this would be a really good place to do some data validation. And I'm not sure why that seemed to not take place. Now, let's move away from the Steele et al. Paper. Well, I guess to sort of wrap up why that all is important is because when we think about sort of, this idea that basically every forest everywhere is overgrown, especially in the Sierra Nevada or the Southern Sierra Nevada, I think what we're really seeing is that there's been a lot of fire activity and drought and bark beetle activity in recent decades. And that has certainly opened up forest. And so on the one hand, we're hearing that forests are really overgrown. On the other hand, we're hearing that, there's just sort of, tree mortality sort of epidemic that's been happening for the last decade or so. And that can be due to drought and bark beetles or wildfire. And so it's a little paradoxical, right? I mean, on the one hand, we're saying forests are really, really dense. They're too dense. They're overgrown. On the other hand, we're saying there's just sort of, exceptional mortality that's taking place. And so you can't both things can't necessarily be true at the same time. This natural mortality that is happening from these disturbances is definitely opening up forest in a lot of areas. And so I think Dr. Hanson will go into this a little bit more, but I just want to make that clear that there is a lot of sort of natural thinning that is already happening on the ground in a lot of these forested areas across the Western United States, particularly in these more frequent fire forest types. And so we can actually, I don't want to just show everything from California. Let's look at an area in New Mexico. So we're going to zoom here. This is the Gila Wilderness, and this is from 1996. So you can see this is a pretty dense ponderosa pine dominated forest in these mountains in New Mexico. And over the next 20 or so years, 20 plus years, there were 4 fires that took place. And this is what it looks like in 2022. So the forest is not lost. It hasn't all burned up at high severity, and there's no mature trees anymore. What has happened is that the forest has definitely opened up quite a bit in a lot of places. We still have these sort of denser patches scattered throughout, but we have a lot of heterogeneity on the landscape. We have some areas that have clearly burned at high severity, but a lot of moderate severity, a lot of low severity as well. And so we see this in a lot of places in the Western United States where forests are naturally experiencing these disturbances and are becoming more open. And so, the idea that like this forest is overgrown is certainly not correct. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, this is sort of the other thing that we touched upon in the chapter, is I want to. This is a really important concept that I don't think gets talked about enough, but this is related to bark beetles. It can apply to wildfire as well, but I want to talk about it with bark beetles. So there is a lot of effort. There has been a lot of effort over the last several decades to do thinning, forest thinning, as a way to try to prevent tree mortality from bark beetle outbreaks subsequent after the thinning. Okay, and this is a paper that gets cited in a lot of national forest projects. A lot of Forest Service thinning projects, they will actually, in their environmental documents, they'll often cite this paper as a reason why they need to do the thinning. And they'll say it's because, look, there was more mortality in areas that were unthinned compared to areas that were thinned once bark beetle activity increased after they did this work. Okay, so this is what is reported in that paper. This is the figure that you see, and you see here again the control. We're looking at the number of trees killed by bark beetles, and you can see that there is a significant difference here between their most intensive thinning treatment and their control treatment, where they didn't thin any trees. The way that they sort of represent this is our project here. It actually worked, right? We were able to prevent a substantial number of trees from being killed in this subsequent bark beetle outbreak. So, okay, so we're gonna look at this a little bit differently. So what I did was I reconstructed their data. You can figure all this out from their tables, but they don't really talk about this. This is the mortality, the cumulative mortality from the thinning and the bark beetle outbreak that happened after the thinning, right? So in the unthinned areas, obviously there's no tree mortality from thinning because thinning did not occur. And as you increase in the thinning intensity, so the highest intensity of thinning, they basically killed nearly 300 trees per hectare to save just a handful of trees from being killed in a subsequent bark beetle outbreak, right? So this is what is being presented is just the green in that paper, and they're looking at that as a success. Like obviously there's a little bit more bark beetle mortality in the unthinned area compared to the most intensively thinned area. But when you look at it this way, there's far more tree mortality from the thinning plus the bark beetles in all of these thinning treatments. And that is a really important concept. And it's one that's not really discussed in the scientific literature, and certainly not discussed in these Forest Service projects. This is the last sort of thing I'll show you. This is from another completely different paper where they weren't really looking at bark beetles so much, but they were looking at drought mortality. And you can kind of see this just in the graphs here that they report in this paper, where if you look at basal area, look at the control. So this is unthinned, right? Over the period of analysis, yes, it definitely went down, right? It decreased because of drought. There was a lot of mortality, but it's still significantly greater than the areas that were treated, that were thinned, right? So you still had more biomass total in the unthinned areas compared to the thinned areas. And you can see, there's some differences with what species are experiencing that sort of decrease in basal area mortality. But the point here is that you still have more carbon, more biomass in the system in these unthinned areas. I think that's it. That's all I'm going to talk about today, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll hand it back over to Doug. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bryant. That was wonderful. Again, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section, and we'll go through them after both speakers are done. And so let me now introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Chad Hanson. He is a research ecologist and director of the John Muir Project of Earth Island Institute. John Muir Project is headquartered in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California and also has an office in Washington, D.C. Chad has also served on the National Board of Directors of the Sierra Club. He has a PhD in ecology from the University of California, Davis, with a research focus on fire ecology in conifer forest ecosystems. He's published several dozen scientific studies and articles in peer-reviewed journals pertaining to forest and fire ecology and climate change. In 2017, the New York Times described Chad as being on, quote, the cutting edge of ecological research, end quote. Chad is the author of the 2021 book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And he is co-editor of the 2015 book, Nature's Phoenix, and the recently released second edition of that book that is the basis for this webinar series. With that, let me turn it over to Chad.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And great presentation, Bryant. All right, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that will work just fine. So you will all have to let me know. All right. Are folks seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
All right, good deal. Okay, so I'm going to focus today's talk on this notion that the forests, that current forests are overgrown in the sense that there's just too many trees, there's too much biomass relative to historical forests. In other words, that they're unnaturally dense. We hear this all the time. And it's a narrative that is used in political circles, and it's an economic narrative as well, to promote logging policies and rollbacks of environmental laws. And we're seeing really an epidemic of those sorts of proposals right now. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to focus on, and this is something, you know, we could discuss this in any forested region of the West, and there are a lot of similar issues that go on. I'm going to focus on the Sierra Nevada for the purposes of today's discussion. All right, and you can get a lot more information about this in Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix, and in Chapter 11 in particular on this subject. And again, you know, Bryant and I are covering Chapter 11 here today. All right, so what I'm going to do today is just sort of walk you through a sort of deconstruction of some of the methodological problems and demonstrable errors in a whole series of studies that have been published by scientists, some universities, some agency, but scientists funded by the United States Forest Service, and in some cases by some logging companies. Now, you know, intention is unknown and unknowable. And so it could be these are innocent mistakes. It could be it's something else. So I don't make judgments about that. I'm just going to present what I see as a series of significant methodological problems. And when you add them all up, they point to the false conclusion that current forests are much denser than they should be. And I'll explain why that's not true. All right. So, and also why actually current forests are, generally speaking, less dense than they were historically. Problem number one is that these studies generally select the densest of the current forest stands for comparison to historical conditions. And what are generally omitted are current forest stands that recently burned in mixed severity fires, where a lot of trees were killed, and therefore live tree density is not nearly as high, or heavily logged forests, where the great majority of the trees have been removed by logging. Instead, what we tend to see is a selection and a focus on a subset of the forested landscape that is much, much denser than the average. And that's a source of bias, whether it's intentional or unintentional. It's a really significant source of bias. One of the key aspects of this is in one of these studies never mention the fact that when they focus on the denser stands in the current forest, They don't mention the fact that most of our forests are far below their natural carbon storage levels, their biological carbon storage potential, due to many decades of carbon removal from logging. And there's a whole series of studies on this. I've listed 3: Erb et al. 2018, Strasberg et al. 2020, and Schmitz et al. 2023. And the bottom line is that our forests could store a lot more carbon if we'd stop pulling so much carbon out of them through logging operations, both removing live trees, through so-called thinning operations, which are timber sales, and removing dead trees through post-fire logging timber sales. That carbon removal is enormous, and it's been going on for over 150 years in forests of the Sierra Nevada, about 170 plus, and it continues to this day. So, we talk about in the book how if you follow the overgrown forest narrative, this notion that that based on these methodological errors, that our current forests are much denser, and therefore we need to remove a bunch of trees. What you would actually do is further exacerbate and worsen the forest carbon deficit that our current forests are experiencing because of 170 plus years of logging. And also some of the largest logging proposals that we have ever seen in the history of the National Forest System being proposed right now on national forests of the Sierra Nevada under the Biden administration, as the Forest Service is targeting the last best mature and old growth forests before any policies can be enacted. That's its own issue. So I talked about the first problem. This is the second one. The second one is kind of like the other side of the coin from the first one, which is these studies tend to select the least dense of the historical forests for comparison to current forests, which is a major problem. So they have often excluded vast bodies of evidence that tend to be data sets or portions of the field surveys from these historical surveys a century ago that include many of the densest forests. Those have been omitted. And we found in a paper we published in 2016, Hanson and Odian, that these previous papers by Forest Service scientists had excluded 94% of the historical forest survey locations and included most of the densest forest. Another source of bias. Now, there were open forests and there were dense forests historically. The truth is that they were highly variable. But this notion that they were basically homogeneously open and park-like and low density, this cartoonish notion of historical forests is nothing short of fiction. It is simply not true. There are stacks of scientific studies showing that forests were highly variable. Many of them were very, very dense. Historically, including ponderosa pine and mixed conifer. And we have many reconstructions, many original data sets from a century ago from forest surveys. And we also have a lot of photographic evidence. And so I'm going to show a series of photos, from about a century ago of these forests in the Sierra Nevada. And obviously you can see this area was extremely dense. Lots of big trees, medium-sized trees, lots of small trees, lots of heterogeneity, but certainly a lot of biomass. Another photo from a century ago, another dense forest. And again, there are open forests too, but I'm going to show you what you're not typically being shown, which is all the dense forests. And there are many, many photos like this. I'm just showing a small sampling of them. So problem number 3. This series of studies from Forest Service funded scientists consistently omits what we call correction factors. That were instituted by the early United States Forest Service a little over a century ago when they were doing these historical forest surveys back around 1910, 1911, all the way through about 1916. They realized that their method was grossly underestimating tree density. And the reason for this was simple. They used transects, so kind of long linear plots that were 132 feet wide, so 66 feet on the right and on the left of the surveyors as they walked through the forest, and they'd go through and they'd count the trees. The problem is that they did this by visual estimation, and the surveyors didn't measure this with actual tape measures or any other physical measurement. They visually estimated. And there were two major problems that came up. Number one, they tended very, very strongly to overestimate distance. So they would look 30 or 40 feet and they would think it was 66 feet. And so they were actually surveying trees in a much, much smaller area than they were supposed to, and therefore they were counting far fewer trees. But then they would average those trees across the entire theoretical survey area, which was much larger, oftentimes twice as big. The other problem is that oftentimes the forests were so dense that they couldn't see 66 feet to the left or to the right. And so they just count what they could see. That might be 20 feet, it might be 45 feet, but it was oftentimes a lot less than 66. And so the Forest Service realized in a whole series of reports and back and forth angry correspondence letters that they had a major problem. And so they instituted correction factors. Basically, they had to pretty much double the tree density that was being recorded in the field. And so this is very, very well documented. There's stacks of documents about this in these historical records in the National Archives. I've read them very carefully. And yet, those correction factors with regard to the historical forest density were ignored, not mentioned, not applied by this series of Forest Service studies. That's a major source of bias. So they were basically massively underreporting the density of historical forests. And this is just another example. A forest a century ago. Imagine if you were one of those surveyors in 1911 walking through this area, looking left, looking right. You would not be able to see 66 feet. You probably wouldn't be able to see half that far. Okay, and so problem number 4 is omitting evidence in historical surveys that indicate that many of the open low density forests, and like I said, those were part of the system too, but they omitted evidence that many of those were actually were the result of high intensity fire patches. And so, in other words, it wasn't just because there was frequent low intensity fire. That happened too, and some open stands were the result of that, but not that many. Many of them were actually areas that burned at moderate or high intensity fire. It killed most of the trees, and therefore what remained was relatively low density in terms of the live trees. But it gives you a very different impression of the dynamic nature of the historical forests, and in terms of whether our current forests are natural, if you understand that those lower density areas were oftentimes created by higher intensity fire, not necessarily frequent low severity surface fire. And so, and inexplicably, the records of these high intensity fire patches are in the same file folders as all the other data, including the tree density data from these century-old forest surveys. It's hard to understand why those data did not get included and why they weren't mentioned. Here's just one photo, again from these series of century-old photos. And it just shows an area that's very, kind of open, low density. But if you look closer, you can see that it's mostly montane chaparral, which is strongly associated with high intensity fire, and it's native shrubs that are extremely important in the ecosystem. And their germination and reproduction and proliferation is strongly tied to high intensity fire. If you look closer, you can see the standing snags and the down logs on the ground amidst the shrubs. This was a high intensity fire patch with pockets of surviving trees, which is very common. So in some cases, there are even much larger high intensity fire patches. And there are large numbers of photos from this historical data set of large high intensity fire patches as well. That was a natural part of the ecosystem, just like it is now. And what you see is in many of these cases, you'll see pockets of live trees, like you see in the middle of this. Of course, that would, if you didn't understand what this is, you would think, oh, this was a very low density forest maintained by frequent low intensity surface fire, when in fact it was a large high intensity fire patch with some scattered surviving live trees. Okay, so problem number 5 is omitting small trees from the historical forest density surveys. This is a major problem because small trees were extremely numerous in these historical surveys. Oftentimes, threefold, fivefold, tenfold more numerous than the larger trees. And so it was a huge source of bias to exclude the trees that are less than 1 foot in diameter or less than 6 inches in diameter, depending on the data set. major problem. And it again created the misimpression that these forests had a very open park-like understory, when in fact, they had a very dense understory, most of them, with many small trees and a lot of shrub cover, again, from mixed intensity fires that included low intensity fire, but also included patches of moderate and high intensity fire. And so, again, in these historical century-old photos, you can see lots of evidence of this. You see the big trees, but you also see the small trees. A fire will come through, it'll kill the small trees, and then it's some decades before the next fire happens and trees regenerate. And that is a cycle that goes on and on until you get the next high-intensity fire that kills most or all the trees on a longer interval, maybe 300 years. But in the meantime, in these multi-decadal intervals, small trees get killed by the surface fires and then they grow. And so there was always small trees in the understory. And you see this, over and over and over again in these historical photos and other data sets. All right, so this is the last problem I'll talk about, and I'll wrap it up in a moment. We can go to Q&A. But problem number 6 is operating as if entire stacks of contrary peer-reviewed science does not exist. Because as you might imagine, as these studies have been published by the Forest Service funded scientists over the years, a lot of other scientists looked at it carefully and said, hey, there's a problem there. Hey, there's another problem. And they're seeing a series of problems. And they were correcting those problems in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. So there are now stacks of scientific studies demonstrating these methodological flaws and correcting the record. And yet these scientists funded by the Forest Service continue to publish studies with all these methodological flaws and not even mentioning that the studies that corrected the flaws even exist. And that's a major problem. And again, whether it's an innocent mistake or it's intentional, I can't say, but it's a pervasive pattern. And we documented this pattern in Baker et al. 2023. We found that whether it was intentional or unintentional, it caused a falsification of the scientific record and regarding historical forest density. And that falsification is being used to promote logging policies and rollbacks of environmental laws. Now, one of the other problems here, and this is something I just have to talk about, is that some of these scientists funded by the Forest Service have engaged in a pattern of personal attacks, character attacks on independent scientists who have dared to publish studies in peer-reviewed journals that have corrected some of these methodological errors and have pointed these errors out. And that's unacceptable. Those scientists tend to get rewarded in the form of grants by the Forest Service and also in terms of additional exposure and public promotion at the courtesy of taxpayers. And that's a serious problem. And it's a problem that is, I think, causing many independent scientists to be concerned about whether they can even pursue the evidence without being attacked, and that just shouldn't happen. So what does that all mean? When you add it all up, when you correct these methodological errors, when you include all the data, the missing tree data, the missing survey data, when you include all of the data that these Forest Service studies excluded improperly, what we found is that historical forests, in terms of trees per acre or trees per hectare, take your pick, were 7 times denser in mixed conifer forests than the Forest Service studies claimed, and they were 17 times denser than the Forest Service studies claimed in ponderosa pine forests. We document this in Baker et al. 2018, and this finding is uncontested in the scientific literature. Again, their approach has been to pretend or ignore this research and pretend like it doesn't exist, which is not how science is conducted. So I'll just wrap up with this. I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again. In these denser, more carbon-rich forests, they have a very cool, moist, sheltered microclimate, shady microclimate that acts as a climate buffer against the extreme weather that is driven by climate change and by climate factors. Because of this climate buffer, denser mature forests and old forests that are denser, they tend to burn at lower severities in wildfires, not higher severities. And that's what the best and most comprehensive research is finding at this point. That's good news, because what it means is that our climate change mitigation of increasing protection for forests so they can store more carbon, so they can absorb more carbon from the atmosphere, protecting our best carbon sink to get us out of this existential climate crisis is not at odds with wildfire management or biodiversity goals. In fact, they're very much in harmony. But of course, thinning undermines this climate buffer, and that's a major issue. I've talked about that in previous presentations. It's beyond the scope of this one, but I felt it had to be said once again. All right, so if you want more information, of course, Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix, our new book, chapter 11 on this topic. And if you want a lot more information on the subject as well, you can check out my book, Smokescreen. And I will leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Chad. So a reminder, everyone, please post your questions in the question and answer section for Zoom, and then I will be reading them to the presenters. So why don't we start with this question. It says, the Southern California Water Dialogue is having a series on wildfire. North Yuba forest management was the topic yesterday. It was all about thinning and the dangers of ladder fuels. Next time is about the science of wildfires. They called the small branches and understory as waste and ladder fuel that causes the crown fires. What do you think?
So it's nowhere near that simple. A lot of these notions come from narratives developed decades ago, basically by people who thought this makes common sense to me, and therefore I'm going to say this is truth. But they really haven't been tested empirically. And when they do get tested empirically, oftentimes we find the truth is very much at odds with the things that might seem intuitively correct on the surface. People thought denser forests means that they'll burn more intensely because there's more fuel. It doesn't work that way because of the microclimate. And this is one of those examples. Forests that have small trees and lower branches, that actually acts as a windbreak against the winds that drive flames. There's a concept in fire science called mid-flame wind speeds. It's measured at about 20 feet above the ground, about 6 meters above the ground. And what actually buffers those winds and cuts down on mid-flame wind speeds is not as much the largest trees, which have oftentimes branches that start well above 20 feet, but it's also small trees and lower branches on the larger trees. So those so-called ladder fuels are actually the thing that in a very significant way cuts down on and reduces the mid-flame wind speeds that drive the flames. And as mid-flame wind speeds go down, so does wildfire intensity typically. So it's not that simple at all. And oftentimes, it's the opposite of what people assume. And this is one of those circumstances.
Bryant, is there anything you want to add on that? Okay, that's good. Next question asks, has there been an attempt to map forest extent prior to colonization and logging?
That's a good question. There are a lot of historical data sets. Some of those include maps. So we do have that. The best work on this was done by the General Land Office in the mid 1800s, about 170 years ago, up to about 150, 140 years ago. This was basically the precursor to the Bureau of Land Management. And the General Land Office went out and just surveyed, just tens of millions of acres of areas. It's amazing. There's a whole series of papers that have been done on this. The best work on it has been done by Bill Baker and Mark Williams, just extraordinary work backed up by the largest series of scientific validations and cross validations and accuracy checks that I've ever seen in any scientific field in forest and fire ecology. And so those data sets from the General Land Office actually are spatially explicit. And so you can actually go to a specific location and find out whether they said there was forest there or not. United States Geological Survey did a lot of that too, a little bit later, more like 1880s, 1890s, through about 1905 or so. So yeah, there are some data sets that do that, and they're pretty good.
Great. Bryant, anything to add?
You could look at the land fire biophysical settings data set that gives you an idea of what could or perhaps should be there, based on a bunch of different variables that go into the model. And so that could be one way to sort of get a sense of the maximum extent of different forest types, but it doesn't really tell you what a specific area looked like, because of different, human or natural disturbances prior to colonization.
Great. Okay, a question specific to your talk, Bryant. In your talk, the question asks, the last graph, beetles are relatively low in all forest conditions. Would beetles get higher over greater time in the bar graph at the far right?
The last graph. So I had a line graph. That was my last graph. This may be referring to the bar graph. Perhaps it was the beetle activity was low. I guess whoever's asking the question is getting that from the fact that the number of trees killed per hectare were pretty low. Is that?
I think the question is, at least my read of it, the question is would beetle mortality increase in some dramatic way over time? So yeah, I mean,
it certainly can. I mean, it certainly can. Yes, beetle activity. There's different levels of like a beetle outbreak. There are there's all sorts of different terms for it that I don't want to get into, but yeah, I mean, you could have more substantial beetle mortality. I'm trying to, I guess, understand what.
I think I can address it just by saying that there's a second Baker et al. 2023 paper, Baker et al. 2023b, and we actually looked at this question. We quantified tree mortality from beetles versus fire versus prescribed fire versus mechanical thinning all across the Western United States in frequent fire forest types. And high levels of tree mortality from beetles it's extremely rare. I mean, it happens at very small spatial scales, but across the landscape, it's extraordinarily rare to have basically a high intensity mortality patch from beetles. It's not that uncommon from fire, of course. It's part of the mix. It's mostly low and moderate in fire, but there are significant high intensity fire patches. Beetles are very different. It happens, but it's very, very, very uncommon.
And are you talking about frequent fire forest types? Is that what you were saying, Chad? Yeah, because that's what that graph was actually from. It was from a Jeffrey Pine stand study.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there are other forest types that obviously have very important relationships with bark beetles, like the mountain pine beetle in lodgepole pine stands, like in Rocky Mountain lodgepole pines, and you can have pretty intensive beetle mortality in those areas. So there are also different dynamics between different forest types.
Yeah. But other researchers have looked at, lodgepole pine, for example, and have reported similar things where if you're thinning to try to prevent tree mortality from beetles, you're going to tend to kill a lot more trees with the thinning than the beetles would kill.
Yeah.
Probably worse in the frequent fire forest types, though.
Next question. Is it generally true that denser forests hold and recycle moisture better than open forests? If so, should we be discussing forest hydrology more?
Yes, and yes. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Forest hydrology is key. Look, trees are a substantially very large portion of the weight of a given tree, whether it's live or dead, is water. And then when they die and when they fall, that even goes up. So a large down log, just for example, and this was a Forest Service study from years ago, even in a drought year, a large down log can soak up and store 25 times more water per cubic foot than the surrounding soil, like giant sponges. When you're removing trees from forests, whether it's down logs or snags or live trees, in large part what you're doing is removing water from the system and the capacity of the system to retain, absorb, and store water. And you will affect the hydrology and you will dry out the system. Interestingly, there's some really cool research that's been done on fire severity and hydrology in high intensity fire patches when a fire patch is high and creates snag forest habitat. it actually enhances water retention and creates sort of quasi-wetland effect. There's some discussion of this in that paper that Bryant mentioned earlier, Stevens et al. 2021, and some other earlier research. Pretty cool, interesting stuff.
Next question. How can individuals and communities push back against the overgrown forest narrative and advocate for policies that prioritize ecological integrity and natural regeneration?
Well, the simplest answer is get the Mixed Severity Fires Nature's Phoenix book, read it, make notes, talk to us and other co-authors, and go to the websites of organizations that are that have independent scientists that are doing a lot of this work, and they have fact sheets and things that non-scientists can use very effectively, and then raise your voice. This is science is not an ivory tower thing, certainly not in the 21st century. Everyone needs to get involved because there's a lot of misinformation out there that's being driven, frankly, by economics and politics, and sometimes just by fear and ignorance. And we just can't afford that right now. The stakes are too high.
Bryant, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's good.
Good. Okay, this is more of an alert than a question, and I'll just encourage people to go to the Q&A thing to see this and see the link. An alert that the Caldor fire comment period ends this Friday. It says, don't miss your chance to make a difference, sign our petition. It provides that link. So for anyone who's interested in that, please go to the Q&A section, and it's currently at the bottom of that, the message from Joshua French. Sorry. There were a couple questions related to the historic photos you showed that I wanted to combine. One, let me scroll back up to that. One of the black and white photos of 100 years ago had some trees with no bark. What was that about? Is that person asks. And then another person asked whether there's a good place to find these historic photos compiled.
Yeah, Brian can answer the second question. I'll just briefly answer the first one. And by the way, there's additional data sets of historic photos. Some of them are older. They go back to the late 1800s or earlier. So basically, the trees without bark, those are snags, just trees that died naturally in the forest, and then after some years, the bark flakes off, and so you get that kind of interesting look. So some of those trees were snags, most of them were live trees, but it was a mix.
In terms of where you can find old photos, a lot of these come from California. The Wieslander vegetation type mapping project that was back in the 30s and the 40s. You can find older photos. I found a lot through, let me think. I think Cal Photos has a lot of historical photos if you know how to look for them. It's been a while since I've gone through and looked at these data sets. And maybe Berkeley has a bunch of photos on their online library, photo library. And yeah, some of them do go back into the 1800s. A lot of them are from the early 1900s. There's certain photographers that were really prolific. The Wieslander vegetation type mapping project that was very prolific. That was one of the main things they were doing besides surveying. They were actually taking photos, but that was mainly in California. But there were some other people that were out, doing a lot of photography, either for the federal government or just for other purposes. You can find some really interesting photos from like Montana, Idaho, from the big burn back in 1910. That a lot of those are post-fire, but you can get a sense of pre-fire density from the snags and stuff like that. There's an interesting. It doesn't have photos, but there is an interesting Forest Service general technical document from 2005 called Fire in the Forest, A History of Forest Fire Control on National Forests in California from 1898 to 1956. And one of the really interesting things in that report is the author talks about all of these, basically all these diaries that were kept by people that were coming to California during the gold rush period. So this would have been the late 1840s, early 1850s. And so there were a lot of guys that were sort of walking through the Sierra Nevada, especially, and they were actually describing forest conditions. And he said in this report, there were hundreds of descriptions of forest, wildlife, and scenery during these years, and that these accounts most often described forest conditions as dark, dense, or thick, rather than open or park-like. So that was an interesting thing. So there are lots of historical documents that sort of get into what did forests look like, at least in the 1800s and the early 1900s. That go beyond just photos and go beyond like scientific studies.
A question returning to the topic of what gets presented as ladder fuels. Is it just small trees that are being described as ladder trees, or are you also seeing larger trees being portrayed as ladder fuels?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We routinely see large trees, mature trees, even old growth trees being included under the rubric of so-called ladder fuels and being sold and logged and removed under that guise. Basically, the way it's being spun these days in the typical thinning project, so-called in the Sierra Nevada, is that if it's smaller than the largest tree in the area, it's potentially a ladder fuel. It was years ago, it was mostly 12 inches in diameter and less in the 2001 Sierra Nevada Framework Forest Plan, and they changed that, and then it went up to 30 inches in diameter at breast height. It's about 8 feet in circumference, pretty big old tree, and they're describing those as so-called ladder fuels. Now they've come up with a new and creative interpretation the Forest Service has of their forest plan, and now in many of these new huge thinning projects, it's 40 inches in diameter at breast height. These are old growth trees, and they're calling them ladder fuels, because somewhere there's a 45-inch diameter tree nearby. This notion is being abused to the point where it doesn't even pass the laugh test. It's outrageous. We're just seeing like widespread, large-scale fraud on this, and the public is not as fully aware of this as they should be, or the press, because there's a lot of messaging coming from scientists funded by the Forest Service, with interviews set up by the Forest Service Public Affairs Department, telling the public that all they're doing is thinning small trees and underbrush, which is flatly untrue.
Next question. Why are densely planted tree plantations not called out in discussions of overgrown forests?
That's a good question. I would say candidly, if I had to guess, the main reason that they're not focused on dense young tree plantations is because there's hardly any timber volume there to make money from for lumber, and because the trees are too small, and so they don't really focus on that. You will see some big logging projects in like 60-year-old plantations, areas that were clear cut 60 plus years ago, where the trees are actually pretty big now in some cases, 15, 18 inches, 20 inches in diameter in really productive areas, and they'll come in and cut most of those trees. But in these young tree plantations, there's just not much timber volume there, and so they don't focus on it. So yeah, but again, like tree plantations, young tree plantations, they do tend to burn relatively more intensely than dense mature forest. They definitely do. But as I've said before, fire intensity, fire severity, it's driven mostly by weather and climate factors. Drought year, hot, dry, windy conditions. That's what drives fires. Even the young dense plantations, they burn mostly at low and moderate severity when these big fires occur. The portion of high severity will be relatively higher than it will be in mature forest, but it's still mostly low and moderate.
There's a question that says, how does all of this account for pre-Columbian indigenous (cultural) burning? Chad used the term natural several times, but does this not challenge this idea of natural to some degree? And the person later adds, I wonder if the discourse around indigenous fire is another rhetorical tool to justify thinning, ?
Well, let me just say this, because that's a really, really good question. And I've said this many times before, and I'll say this again because I think it's another thing that bears repeating. Fire is natural in forests. It's been natural from lightning strikes, not just for thousands of years, not just for tens of thousands of years, but for tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years in these ecosystems, long before any humans existed. And it's been natural for thousands of years after the first peoples came to this continent. And so what we have seen, and you don't have to remove any trees before you reintroduce fire, whether it's Native American cultural burning or whether it's what we call managed wildfire, also known as wildland fire use, letting lightning strikes burn for ecological benefits in more remote forests if it's not close to a town. So the common denominator here is that both Native American cultural burning and wildfires from natural lightning strikes have been suppressed since colonization and since these logging and fire suppression policies. And that suppression is wrong. It's wrong in both counts. And so both were much more common historically before colonization, before fire suppression and logging. There was a lot more Native American cultural burning. There was a lot more wildfire from lightning strikes, at least in forests. And so I think we need to facilitate policies to remove administrative barriers to both, and we need more of both. And we should be mutually supportive of both goals, and communities should be mutually supportive to facilitate that, so that tribes can do the burning that's important to them for multiple reasons. For tribes, for reasons of their own, and I see it as a rights issue. And also, there's so many wildlife species and plant species that need fire, and some of them need high intensity fire in the mountain forests, like giant sequoias for reproduction, like blackback woodpeckers for nesting and roosting habitat, like California spotted owls for foraging habitat, and a whole series of wood warblers, and many other species that I could name, plant and animal, hundreds and hundreds of them. And so, for ecological benefits and from a justice issue, a justice standpoint, I think we need to be make common cause and facilitate more burning of both types in forests. Some ecosystems have too much fire, like Southern California chaparral. We don't want to add fire where there's too much fire. But in forests, it's generally the opposite. We still have a deficit.
Next question. In comments to agencies, should we be calling out the fact that these scientists are funded by the Forest Service and timber industry, or is that counterproductive?
Oh, I think we should be calling it out. Yeah, it's important information. It's kind of like the elephant in the room, and people don't talk about it enough, mostly because they don't know. But if you go to the acknowledgement section of each of these studies, you can see who funds them, and you can also just see in their little affiliations at the top page who they work for. Some of them work directly for the Forest Service. Some of them are university scientists, but they get big grants from the Forest Service. You can find that out in the acknowledgement section of the study.
Next question. What are the roles of fuel treatments in forests that have experienced heavy logging?
I'm not sure I understand the question. In other words, what is being done under the rubric of fuels treatments in forests that have been heavily logged?
I think it could also be, what do you think should be done? Is there a role for fuel treatments in forests?
Okay. I mean, whether it's a forest that has no history of logging, or a forest that has it's been logged, once, twice, 3 times over the decades, the centuries. There's no substitute for natural processes. There is just no substitute for time and natural carbon accumulation for mixed intensity wildfires. Also, like I said, lifting administrative barriers to allow more Native American cultural burning. There's no substitute for the natural cycles of drought and tree mortality, or what I call snag recruitment, from drought and native bark beetles. And these are native species. They create really important habitat. It's beyond the scope of this particular webinar to talk about it, but we've talked about it before, and I'll just briefly mention that when a tree dies, whether it's from age or from drought and native bark beetles or from fire, in many ways in the forest, it's just starting its life in terms of its contribution to biodiversity. We think of trees like we think of each other as humans, and we shouldn't, because a tree is far more valuable in the ecosystem after it dies. It becomes a snag, and then when it falls, it becomes a down log, and then decays into soil and distributes its nutrients. A standing dead tree of a given size is far more important for wildlife, for cavity nesters, than a live tree of the same size. You obviously need both, but we tend to discount the importance of dead trees, and we should think about them in a completely different way. It's the single most important habitat element in the forest for biodiversity, and of course, the carbon is still there after a tree dies.
Question: from where will the pressure point come to improve federal forest science?
I mean, I think that's a political question. I think people, it goes back to the question earlier. People need to hold policymakers accountable. They need to hold their elected officials accountable at state and federal levels. They need to hold the administration accountable through, every way you can: letters to the editor, opinion editorials, rallies, whatever, comments on projects. People need to get involved. A lot more people need to get involved. And I think that it'll start changing. But until we talk about the problems, until we understand what the problems are and how we're being misled, again, whether it's intentional or unintentional, we are being misled, and to a pretty profound degree. And until we understand that and start talking about and pushing back against it, it won't change. But once we do, it will.
Another question is, so what's causing the perceived higher rate of extensive wildfires in recent times?
I mean, climate change is a huge factor. Look, if we don't get a handle on climate change that is being driven by human activities, fossil fuel burning and logging. Logging's a huge factor. It's not accounted for. Doesn't mean it's not a big factor. It's big. If we don't get a handle on climate change and change our behavior, if we don't rapidly shift to genuine clean energy, not forest biomass, distributed solar, rooftop and community solar is by far the best, in my opinion. And if we don't dramatically increase protection of our best carbon sinks, which are forests and other habitats, but especially forests, if we don't do those two things, we can't turn the corner on climate change. If we don't turn the corner on climate change, it's existential. So climate change, is driving temperatures up. It's throwing weather patterns into chaos, and it is influencing fires. If we don't get a handle on climate change, we will see more fire activity. Right now in forests, we are still below natural levels. We do not want to see levels exceed natural levels. But best way we can basically bring things back into balance is get away from fossil fuels, transition into clean energy, and simultaneously dramatically increase protection for our forests from logging. Just basically protect the forest from carbon removal. And so we need to push back against false solutions like the so-called Fix Our Forests Act that is just based on mountains of disinformation, and really hold politicians accountable, Democrats or Republicans, when they do the wrong thing.
The other thing I'll add is that there is an issue where a lot of our largest fires that tend to burn under the most extreme conditions do tend to be started by humans, unplanned human-caused ignitions. You look in California over the last several years, not so much in recent years, but 2017, 2018, especially, you see a lot of very large fires that have been caused by something like utility line ignitions, and they tend to occur under the most extreme weather conditions. And so that's something that I think we also need to get a handle on. There's also a less well-studied aspect, at least in forest, on the role of non-native plants. All of the historical logging activities and other human activities post-colonization have undoubtedly caused the spread of invasive, grasses and forbs that can ignite more rapidly and spread fire more quickly. this is really well known, especially in shrubland ecosystems. It's a little bit less well studied in forest. And so understanding that aspect, I think, is really important, in ensuring that we're not proliferating, we're not spreading invasive species even more, and changing sort of flammability of ecosystems. I think that those are important points too. All of that, climate and weather is sort of charges all of those things even more. So yeah.
Given the theme of overgrown forests, there's a question that raises the role of shade from large pines. It particularly asks about it in the context of sagebrush ecosystems, but I'd also say more broadly, can you talk about the role of forest density in relation to shade and what it means for cooling streams for fish populations?
Yeah, definitely. Denser forests and higher canopy cover in the cooling shade has all kinds of influences on streams and stream temperatures. Interestingly, even when there's a fire, even those areas that burn at high intensity, it's pretty soon before the post-fire vegetation that's stimulated, the growth of which is stimulated by intense fire. A lot of them shrubs, it's also small trees, oaks. It grows really quickly in the riparian areas and reestablishes that shade. And so in ways that you don't get with logging, because again, the whole purpose of like a logging project under the guise of thinning, for example, is to not just dramatically reduce the density of the forest, but to keep it reduced, to keep going back in again and again. We're in many of these areas in the Sierra Nevada. They were, a thinning project happened 20 years ago, and now they're doing it again in the same area. And it's clear that they intend to do it again and again. The line that people were sold 20 years ago is, oh, well, the forest is too dense. We need to thin it before we can reintroduce fire. That's simply not true. We have half a century of scientific studies showing that you can very easily do prescribed fire or manage wildfire in a forest, even a very dense forest, without removing any trees whatsoever. If you want mostly low intensity effects, you do it during mild fire weather. But that was the narrative 20 years ago. And they said, well, we promise, though, 20 years from now, we'll reintroduce fire, or 5 years or whatever. They never did. And now they're thinning it again. So obviously, this is just about logging.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up there in terms of time. First off, I wanted to remind everyone about getting the book. Some folks had asked about a link for where to get the book and a good price on it. You'll find that not in the Q&A section, but in the webinar chat section. I also wanted to remind you that the next webinar in this series is going to be on Wednesday, October 9th at noon Pacific time. It's on the ecological cost of post-fire interventions. And the speakers will be Michelle Connolly, the Director of Conservation North, and Dr. Dominick DellaSala, the co-editor of Nature's Phoenix. So please be sure to register for that. And if you registered for today's webinar, you'll be receiving a link to the recording of today's webinar. And with that, I just want to thank our speakers, Bryant and Chad again, and thank you all for attending. Have a good day.